Okay, I think we can get started. The tea I made this morning, one of them is an apricot black tea that people have enjoyed before, and the other one is the milk oolong that I have made before as well. I was a little bit sad this morning. My big tea mug actually broke. It fell off of something and shattered. Wah wah. So I have to drink out of small cups that aren't big enough. So today we're diving into the trials of Paul. And it's odd that at the end of the book of Acts, there's this whole series of trials. So this is like Paul has just been rescued from the Jewish plot in Jerusalem and taken to Caesarea. And here he is going to be on trial. The Jews are made to come and to accuse him before the Romans. And so this delegation comes from Ananias and some elders. This is the leadership of the Sanhedrin. And they have a man named Tertullus who comes, and he starts with kind of trying to butter up the Romans. You know, since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your provision, most excellent Felix, reforms are introduced, yada, 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 this troublemaker. But what is really, really sad about this is that it's the opposite of true. That the chief priests, maybe not so much the Sadducees, but certainly the Pharisees, have been antagonized and antagonizing this man for years. Felix was the Roman governor of the area, and he was known to be a harsh and cruel tyrant. He was incompetent. He wasn't a good administrator. Like usual, the Romans didn't send their best and their brightest off to the Holy Land to be the governor. And during his time, several uprisings occur. He murders some of the Jews in Caesarea. That's the town where they're at now, where this trial is taking place. And so it's odd. It's almost this bitter sort of dripping irony that they're calling him like, you know, oh, we enjoy this peace and prosperity under your direction. You're so great and everything's fine, when really they're diametrically opposed to him. The Jews, in fact, even had to appeal to the emperor himself. They send a delegation off, and they're heard because one of the chief priests had a connection to someone in the imperial administration as a brother of someone who was there. And so it's very disingenuous. It's not being authentic. They're lying through their teeth. You know, this is the political end of things where you sort of smile and look nice while you hate their guts and are working against them. And it's important to think about that because there's this contrast in these trials between Paul, who's being honest about his experience of Jesus, who's being honest about where he's at, and he's being accused of violating the law. But the people who are accusing him don't seem to be bothered by violating the law at all. They're not upset, they're not concerned. And it's odd because they're willing to violate the 10 Commandments, the big pieces of the law. They're willing to lie in this case in order to convict Paul. If you remember, they had even plotted his murder on the way to Caesarea, and they had lied then too. And so I think it's exposing this central piece of the people of Jesus' time, or the people afterwards now, are not quite as interested in religion as they claim to be. They're far more interested in politics. or at least when something threatens their sense of security, they're strongly willing to act, and to act in dramatic ways. And this is actually a time of increasing tension in the Holy Land, not decreasing tension. So it's not a time of peace at all. It's a time where they're in the pressure cooker and the heat is turned up. So they charge Paul with a series of things, that he's a pest. Okay, you could be a pest, right? That shouldn't be a charge that's worthy of capital punishment. If you have babysitted young kids, or you've seen like a daycare, there's times where kids are pests. You don't think we should kill them. Like, that's not the way it works. He's caused dissension with Jews all over the world. And again, okay, so he's causing a theological debate. Why don't you debate him theologically? That would make sense. Like, he's a religious guy, you're religious people, have one of your religious debates. You're having those all the time anyway. What's wrong with that? He attempted the desecration of the temple. That was with the guy, the Ephesian, I forget what his name was. He showed up and he was an Ephesian, and they think that Paul brought him into the temple past the courtyard of the Gentiles. So it sounds like an inter-Jewish debate, and the Jews say, examine himself if you must. So then Paul responds. He doesn't use the same kind of flattery. He doesn't have the same kind of colorful language. He doesn't sugarcoat the truth. It's only 12 days since he went up to Jerusalem to worship. This isn't a long time. He hasn't been in prison all that long. And this is an important claim, because if it's only 12 days ago, you could find eyewitnesses to what happened. But the Jews don't really want to produce eyewitnesses, because then the truth might come out. So they have to find a way to prevent the eyewitnesses from showing up. Paul says that he wasn't starting a riot. The accusation is baseless. He went to pray in the temple. He was going to cleanse himself from this Nazirite vow. If you remember, James had encouraged him to pay the fees for these Nazirites that had taken a vow to show that he was still a faithful Jew. So he's actually doing an act of Jewish piety. And it's the people who are accusing him that started the riot. He worships the God of their ancestors in accordance with the law and the prophets. And he's on trial because of hope in the resurrection. He admits that he belongs to this way of Judaism that becomes Christianity. He came to bring alms and offerings. He didn't have a crowd or disturbance. And in fact, it's the Jewish people of Asia that are upset. It's not the Jews who are even there. And what he's saying is, like, they're accusing me, but they're accusing me based on the accusation of this other group of people that's no longer there, the Jews from Ephesus. They probably went home after the festival. And so there's no way to trace the history. There's no way to easily prove these crimes against him. So Felix decides to wait for Lysias to come. Lysias is another Lysias is a tribune. Maybe he's later. So Felix and his wife come to listen to Paul. And this is very much like the story of St. John the Baptist and Herod, where Herod likes to listen to him preach. Herod likes to hear what he has to say. He never lets John out of prison, but he's interested. It piques his curiosity. Here is a similar kind of thing. I'm just trying to think. Okay, that's what happens. Now I'm on the right track. So he says he's going to wait for Lysias to come, but in the meantime, he and his wife, this is Felix and Drusilla, they come to listen to Paul. And they're curious about him, but he begins to preach about righteousness and self-restraint and judgment. And that sort of sets Felix off. That provokes him. And I think the same thing happens to us pretty constantly. It's easy to sort of, as long as we're talking about Jesus and love and God and how beautiful it is, everything is fine. But when you take the step to start talking about conversion and its impact on our lives and how we have to change, how part of Christianity is this conviction that God is holy and we are not, that God is someone who is beyond us. Once it starts to have this impact on how you act and morality, then the message is a lot harder to hear. This is where Felix becomes uncomfortable. And probably because Paul was pointing at his behavior. As a Roman, he's not likely a shining pillar of morality. And in the midst of that, you can recognize several different things. The first one is that when it comes to that kind of conviction, the message is a lot harder to hear. I think you can also see that the same thing happens pretty constantly in our own day. It's like people are happy to talk about Jesus and his love, but that morality piece, when it's about how you behave, that's a lot harder. People today will say, well, why don't you just keep your heads out of the bedroom? Why don't you keep your heads away from what I do and just stay in your own lane? But Christianity is a religion that's either all of your life or none of it. It's not Jesus is a nice guy, it's Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Master. And there's also the reality that sin is attractive, that there's something about it that draws us into it, that leads us into the wrong direction, basically. And that makes a big difference. Sometimes in modern psychology, you'll sort of read things like, if you get all of the obstacles out of the way, then humanity tends toward happiness, that we tend toward joy. And so life and this work is removing obstacles. And there's parts of that that are true. We know that, I would say it's true, that we have good desires in our hearts. But all of you know that sin also lies close at hand. That there's something about sin that is a lot harder to get rid of. There's something about sin that's a lot harder to fight against. Because even when we desire to do the right thing, we don't always do it. That's the story of our lives. That's the story that St. Paul talks about in some of his letters. So there is an attractiveness of sin that we have to be ready for. I think this is also where the importance of confession comes in. None of us are perfect. None of us are righteous. St. Paul is also very specific about that. We don't stand before God because of our own merits. We stand before God in need of forgiveness. And he offers that. I mean, that's the beauty of the sacrament. That's the beauty of what we're invited into. That the promise of Jesus is that our sins can be forgiven. That he wants to forgive sins, but he also wants us to admit it and to ask for it. Judgment is an important theme. We're getting into the end of the liturgical year, and this is a time that traditionally focuses around judgment, around the end of our lives and the end of the world. We're living, as you know, in troubled times. This conflagration with Hamas and Israel very easily could brew into a wider conflict, the conflict in Ukraine. There's a number of places that are very, very difficult in the world socially and politically. But you know that even in our own country, there's a massive political divide. We're facing a presidential election. And it's bizarre that things have changed so rapidly in such a short time. You know, that we went from the 1980s and 90s and somewhat of the debate about abortion, and now that's just sort of taken for granted, and the debate is about biology and genetics and things that we never thought would be questioned. And for everything that says we should follow the science and yada, 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 in some areas of life, it's like they're taking this entire area and jettisoning this entire piece of knowledge, this piece of truth. I mean, there's even stories about like students in medical school, and they're not working on things like DNA anymore, because if you talk about DNA, you have to talk about male and female, and they don't want to do that because that's not part of the world that society wants to live in, at least at the moment. And it's like, you mean that we could lose an entire area of medicine and medical practice that's good because of this insanity that surrounds the question of transgenderism? And the answer in some medical schools is yes. It's the only option, because if you're going to commit to this radical agenda, then you have to commit to it. And anything that stands in the way, you have to get rid of. That's kind of creepy. When we think about judgment, it's important to realize too that judgment is a kind of piercing light of truth. You see your life and all of the good you could have done, all of the things that you should have done, all of the places and times where you resisted the grace of God. You'll see it as it is. You'll also see the good that you did and the ripples of grace and all of that together. But I think in the modern world, we've lost our sense of the difficulty of this judgment. We've lost our sense of how scary this kind of day of the Lord is, the great and the terrible day of the Lord. It talks about it in the Old Testament. That judgment is something that's relatively uncomfortable. Even when people talk about, some of the modern prophetic tradition in various places talks about a kind of warning that might come, where God reveals people's consciences. And most of the time along with that, they say like 1 in 10 people will die, because seeing themselves and their conscience like they really are will scare them that badly that they'll just sort of give up and collapse and no longer be alive. I think, again, that's something that we have to wrestle with, because our culture is so emphatic on the love and the mercy of Jesus, and that is true, and we should be emphatic on it. But because we have such a tendency in that direction, it's like we sort of remove the difficulty of judgment. We remove the difficulty of standing before the Lord, sort of exposed as naked before the truth. And in God, we have to hold those things together, that God is merciful and God is just. And God is love, but love doesn't allow or accept sin for what it is. And, oh, I can just do what I want and it's not a big deal because I believe in Jesus. I'm not sure that that kind of position will carry us very far on the other side of judgment, on that day of judgment. And it's important to see it that way, because this is part of the motivation for changing our lives here and now. This is part of what we're invited to do, is when you look at the reality of judgment and when you're like, oh shoot, my life doesn't always measure up to what it needs to, that's part of what gives you the energy to change. That's part of what gives you the energy to say, oh, well, maybe this stuff in my life needs some work. Maybe I do need to work on letting go of sin. Maybe I do need to go back and look at these areas of selfishness. Because if we do, like, now is a time where we can change. Now is a time where we can encounter the grace of God. And I think when you look at the life of St. Paul, and we've seen in the book of Acts, I mean, think of how profound this is, because Paul probably realizes if he had died at the condemnation of Stephen, what would have happened to him? If he had died before his Damascus moment, his life might have taken a very different trajectory. I mean, I think he sees the reality that salvation wasn't just something nice, but is something that he has to rely on. He calls himself in one of his speeches a murderer, maybe with more than just Stephen. And so, you know, if there's hope of salvation, then for him it has to be because of this confidence in the love and the mercy of God, but he takes it seriously. He's not just sort of brushing aside his history and what has happened. So Felix ends his part in our story by wanting to be bribed. Instead of judging Paul's case when Lysias comes around, he just holds him in prison. Now, it must have been a different kind of prison because he allows Paul's friends to take care of him somewhat, but Paul is not free to go. And what you see again is this challenge between, he hears the word of God, he seems to know that this is an accusation of jealousy, that this is the chief priests and the Pharisees and the scribes or whoever they are. They're bringing this accusation because they're jealous. This isn't really a capital crime. So at worst, he should be punished and let go. But he's held because the Jewish leadership has made it an issue. That's a political decision. He's just sort of held indefinitely. Well, at some point, we'll get to judging his case. So he stays in prison for 2 years. Then in 59 AD, Festus arrives and heads toward Jerusalem. So he's going to a feast in Jerusalem. He's just gotten there. The Roman relationship with the Jewish people has continued to grow more rocky. This is only a handful of years before the Jewish rebellion will break out into the open, where they will openly oppose Rome and the Romans will start basically indiscriminate murder. And the chief priests, as soon as Festus arrives, they don't offer to pray for him in this story. They don't introduce themselves. They ask him about Paul. They have been nurturing this hatred and this grudge for years. And so it's kind of insane, because if you were a new governor, you should expect to arrive and people would greet you and there would be pomp and circumstance and ceremony. You're the new person in charge. They want to win your favor. But in this case, they're so upset, they're so lost in their anger that they don't even wait for that to happen. They press him right away. What will you do with Paul? They seem to be convinced that plotting the murder of Paul and plotting to bring him down is a moral thing. In fact, they've been doing it for years at this point, and they're still working at it. It's still like a white-hot kind of anger and rage. You would think that after 2 years, it's like, oh, whatever. If you guys remember what I said 2 years ago, I would be rather surprised. Just because it's like, it's 2 years. I barely remember things that happened 2 years ago. That was, COVID time? And all of the craziness that we were dealing with in that direction. The world was a different place. And it's drifted quite far from our minds, I hope. I hope it's quite far from your mind. I hardly think of COVID at all anymore. And it was something that had consumed our society. And so you would see that if someone, for instance, now is still deathly afraid and paralyzed about COVID, that's kind of an issue because they've been sitting with it for years. That kind of anxiety, that kind of difficulty doesn't play well for the future. Festus realizes what's up, and so he says, well, come back to Caesarea yourselves and charge him. The Romans, in this case, are not quite as ready to play ball as they were in the time of Jesus and as they were earlier in the life of Paul. The Romans have finally had enough with the Jewish leadership, and they're drawing some lines in the sand. Now, ultimately, Paul does get condemned, and he does sort of end up lost, but he doesn't end up that way right away. So after 8 or 10 days, the time is sort of accelerated again. We're back into somewhat real time. He sits in the judgment seat, and they bring Paul. They try to propose serious charges, but they can't sustain them. They're contradicting themselves. The eyewitnesses disagree. And like we said before, they probably don't want real eyewitnesses of what actually happened, because then Paul would be free. Then Paul would not be in the same spot. Paul has committed no crime against the Jews or Caesar or the temple. He defends himself yet again, and Festus asks him about going to Jerusalem to be judged. Paul's response is, they're bringing these charges, they want to kill me, and that kind of capital punishment is a Roman punishment. That kind of capital punishment is something that the Jews can't do. He also knows that the likelihood of him getting a fair trial in Jerusalem is less than zero. These people hate him. And so he doesn't want that option. Festus could be trying to curry favor with the Jewish leadership. He could be trying to get involved with them in a good way, like to earn some brownie points, because they seem set on this. This is a hill that they're willing to die on. And it's not a good thing. So what happens is Paul appeals to Caesar. And this is a bit of a Catholic principle. I think the Catholic Church kind of adopted this from the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, a citizen had a right to appeal any judgment to Caesar himself. Now, it's probably not Caesar himself that's going to hear it. There's sort of like a Roman Supreme Court, because otherwise the emperor would do nothing but hear cases and appeals from around the world. And I guarantee you they didn't do that. But there's this process, and it means that the tribunal of Caesar in Rome has a kind of authority over everywhere else in the Roman world. So decisions can be appealed to Rome itself, and then Rome, Caesar, will decide. And it's not an authority that's always exercised. It's not meant to be that the Roman Empire is about everyone's business, although that can happen and probably did happen. Certain provinces, they were much more interested than other ones. For instance, the province of Egypt was really important to the Romans. Want to know why Egypt was really important? Something that you would not think of. What?
You're not going to think of it, just tell us.
Someone be brave. It has to do with farming.
The Nile, the river.
And the Nile. Egypt actually grew a bunch of grain. Egypt was one of the most productive areas of the Roman Empire. And the Roman emperors knew and found out very readily that if your people are hungry, you're in trouble. If you're in the government and the people are hungry, it's a problem. And it doesn't go well. So they probably took greater care of Egypt. Palestine is not on that list. Palestine is on the list like, oh, someone's got to be in charge of it. Who gets the short end of the stick this year? Oh, you. You know, the political rival of the emperor is someone like, you know, the one that they're sort of setting this person up for failure to go to Israel, because the answer is probably going to be a mess. No matter what happens, it's going to be a mess, because the Jewish people, it's the crossroads of a lot of places. The empires of the ancient world, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Medes, all of that traffic goes through the Holy Land. And so it's never been all that stable, partially because the desert is so hard to cross. So Paul appeals to Caesar. And once he appeals to Caesar, it's sort of like, okay, hands off, he's appealed to Caesar, now he has to go to Caesar. He has to get there. So Festus prepares to send him there. And then, I think this is one of the places where Jesus doesn't show up yet. So then Festus wants to consult King Agrippa. Now, why does Paul appeal to Caesar? I think that's a hard thing to understand. And I don't know if we have good answers for it, or that we have an answer that we can say, yes, this is it. He may have had in mind preaching to Rome. He wanted to get to Rome for a long time. He had been striving to carry the gospel to the whole world. Maybe he sees that that is the only way it can happen. Maybe it's something that Jesus has told him, you need to preach in Rome, and you need to stand before the emperor, and so he sees in this the plan of Christ. But somehow he appeals to Caesar. It could also be he feels the situation is hopeless. What hope does he have if he goes to Jerusalem? They're going to probably kill him on the way, and if he gets there, his trial isn't going to be fair. It's going to be sort of like a communist-run show trial, and he's going to be paraded and killed at best. So then this interlude happens with King Agrippa. So this is where you also see this kind of weird power sharing between the Romans and the Jewish, semi-Jewish leadership of the area. Agrippa is in the line of Herods, and so it's sort of like they have some authority over the Holy Land and Palestine, but not a lot. The Romans keep the purse strings. The Romans are in charge of the military, but Agrippa has something along those lines. So Agrippa and Bernice come, and after several days, the case of Paul is brought up. I think this is one where, so Festus says that this prisoner is sort of left over by Felix, and no one really knows what to do with him. It's not really clear what he's done. He doesn't seem to have committed any important crimes, and he's appealed to Caesar. So Festus sits in his tribunal, and the Jews come to accuse Paul. The crimes were not significant. They're not a rebellion against Rome. It seems to be some kind of theological debate in Judaism. Festus is unsure of how to investigate and hold a trial. This isn't really a Roman problem. I mean, in his mind, if he's sort of the stereotypical Roman, he's probably thinking, well, just have one of your rabbinical debates. You guys debate all the time. Like, you talk, he talks, you disagree, and you keep talking. So Agrippa and Bernice arrive. They have this sort of great ceremony. They're wearing expensive clothes and finery. It's a bit like a parade. Agrippa is trying to impress the new Roman governor. You know, there's all of this political intrigue around. And it's not the kind of time where you're going to get a fair trial or things are very serious. It's sort of like a party and everyone's drinking. So Festus says that he doesn't know what to write to the emperor because he's got to write this letter and tell him why he's sending Paul. What has this man done that he is accused of? And it doesn't seem to be like, he doesn't know what to say. He doesn't know what to do. It's like, crap, we've gotten ourselves into